Delenda est Carthago. The Carthaginians were at first eager to advance, and were not altogether without hope that they would be able to take Rome itself by assault. But when they saw the enemy draw up in order, they abandoned the idea of attacking the city and began devastating the countryside instead. In those first raids, they collected an innumerable amount, for the field of plunder on which they entered was one onto which no one had expected an enemy to set foot. The Punic Wars, Part 5, The Return of the Scipi. Welcome back to Flashpoint History. This is going to be the fifth of a multi-part series on the Punic Wars, that insanely long, not to mention titanic struggle that pitted the greatest powers of the Mediterranean world against each other, and in doing so, defined the course of Western civilization. In our last episode, we left off with the Battle of Cannae, which some herald as being Hannibal's greatest military masterpiece, and others could think of it as, well, being a black stain on the stage of humanity. Either way you look at it, this was a military defeat that was so massive that if it was any other civilization than Rome, it probably would have wiped it clean from the face of the earth. But in this episode, we talk about Rome's return from the brink. I want to emphasize that because we're going to be talking about multiple different theaters of operation, which chronologically at least are happening simultaneously, I've gone ahead and created a video component to the podcast, which is available on YouTube, the link for which is going to be in the description of the podcast below. This probably will make it a lot easier for interpretation of the podcast, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. Now, for those of you who are interested in searching for this more generically on YouTube, type in Flashpoint History, but be advised that Flashpoint is divided up into two words to make it easier to search for. So for those of you out there who are enjoying the show, and I want to thank you because based on what I'm seeing on my bandwidth, it seems like there is a lot more of you. Please give the show a like or spread word about the podcast. If you're interested in getting automatic downloads, subscribe to the series. And if you're coming at me from iTunes or Google Play, be that first cool person on the block to have your words immortalized in that review and rating section. And if you're interested in any type of comments or feedback, I will be available at Flashpoint History, that's all one word, flashpointhistory@gmail.com. Now, obligatory plugs aside, the bottom line here, folks, enjoy the show. There is a painting out there that I find particularly fascinating. It's a painting done of two fighter planes of the Second World War that are flying side by side, almost in parade formation, their wingtips just about touching. Now, what makes this painting a little unusual is that whereas one of the airplanes is a P-47, also known as a Thunderbolt, which, for those of you who are not familiar, it's an American plane, the other airplane is a Focke-Wulf 190, which, if the name doesn't give it away, it's a German. And what makes this painting even more unusual is that it actually depicts a real-life event that happened on June 26, 1943. On that morning, an American aviator by the name of Robert Johnson climbed into the cockpit of his P-47. He and his fighter wing were scheduled to do bomber escort duty that day. But halfway into their morning commute, his fighter wing was ambushed by a flight of the aforementioned Focke-Wulf 190s. Now, if you look at the two airplanes and you compare them, the Focke-Wulf 190 by far is a superior dogfighting machine. And so it didn't come as so much of a surprise that the Germans made mincemeat out of their American counterparts. Johnson took a couple of hits right off the bat. His engine started sputtering out oil into the canopy, and for whatever reason, he wasn't wearing goggles, so he was blinded by this. He had shrapnel in his leg that started bleeding profusely. He started losing altitude. And then to make matters worse, the engine oil inside of his canopy actually ignited on fire. Now, I don't know about you, but if you take your worst, and I mean your absolute worst commute day that you've ever had in your entire life, and then you compare it to this guy, in an airplane, on fire, blinded by oil, bleeding from shrapnel in your leg, losing altitude, being shot at by a German ace, and going down over the Third Reich? Well, then I guess it all becomes a matter of perspective at that point, doesn't it? The title of this painting, by the way, is Not My Turn to Die by a man named Jim Laurer, who does some exceptional work. It's not exactly my favorite title, but it really does get to the point. And as the name implies, this wasn't going to be the end of Johnson. He was able to regain control of his airplane, managed to put out the fire, stop the bleeding somehow, and then, as fate would have it, he and a lone German Focke-Wulf 190 got separated from the rest of their groups and started engaging in their own private duel. This was an intense fight, both men pushing their machines to the extreme limit of what those things could do. Johnson got in a couple of hits, the German got in a ton of hits. And then again, as fate would have it, both men ran out of ammunition. Johnson did the only thing he could do. He put his plane into a beeline back to England, hoping that it would stay together long enough so he wouldn't have to either ditch in France or in the English Channel. And as he was making his way back, he looked across his starboard wing, and he was shocked by what he saw. The German pilot had pulled up along next to him. The German, looking back and forth at Johnson's plane, surveying the damage that he had done, shaking his head in disbelief, not imagining how Johnson's plane could still stay airworthy. These men were flying so close that Johnson could later recall the brown of his leather jacket, the white of the scarf that was wrapped around his neck, the aristocratic air that he had, the blue of his eyes. And then, in a gesture of recognition, almost on the point of being camaraderie, the German raised one leather-gloved hand to his head and saluted Johnson before hitting his plane into a high bank turn and flying back to Germany. It's one thing to be able to show that you have a certain degree of decency or humanity during peacetime, in your everyday life. And it's another thing entirely when you're able to demonstrate these skills during times of war, especially something as catastrophic as the Second World War, arguably one of the most destructive wars in human history. As a history podcaster, especially one who focuses a lot on military history, you learn just about how awful humans can be to one another. But when you see people doing things like this, especially during times of extreme crisis, you realize that maybe, perhaps, there is actually a redemptive quality to human nature after all. One of the best examples that I've come across that shows this sense of redemption actually took place during the Second Punic War. There was a meeting that took place between two men that were arguably some of the greatest tactical military geniuses of antiquity, if not of all time. Ironically, the first time that these two men met as equals, as commanders of their respective armies, they didn't meet on the field of battle. They actually met in a small tent along with their interpreters in order to hash out a peace deal in order to avoid confrontation. And they did this in the backdrop of a war that was so atrocious that you had things like the Battle of Cannae. Now, if you guys recall, Cannae was 50 to 60,000 Roman dead in a single day. This was a battle that some historians have calculated that if the average Roman warrior weighed about 130 pounds, again, people were smaller back then in the aftermath in that battle, in 1 square mile, you would have approximately 6.5 million pounds of human flesh rotting in the sun. The meeting that I refer to doesn't actually take place in the aftermath of Cannae. In fact, the stage that I want to set takes place 14 years later. We're no longer in southern Italy. We're not even in Europe. We're now in the dusty plains of North Africa near a small town named Zama. The situation between Rome and Carthage is drastically different, and it shows. It's embodied in what these two men bring to that negotiating table. On one end, you have Publius Cornelius Scipio, a young maverick Roman general who has brought his impressive army to North Africa for the purposes of ending this war by taking out Carthage. And on the other end, you have Hannibal Barca, a veteran of the war in general, a person who has taught Roman armies once and again a lesson in humility on the field of battle. But here he is now at the head of a ragtag army that's been kind of squashed together in a last-ditch effort in order to prevent the capital from falling. When you look at the written record, people have a tendency to kind of glaze over this meeting and kind of move on to more important things. Some scholars go so far as to say that this meeting never took place, and if you read Livy, he makes Hannibal out to be this guy that approached Scipio on both knees, begging for a peace treaty while he still had an army behind him. I don't buy it. I mean, does this even sound like Hannibal Barca? I think there was a lot more to it than just that. Now, granted, there was a political reason. This was a chance to negotiate a peaceful settlement. There was also a military agenda because both sides were trying to bring in reinforcements. But I also think that Hannibal and Scipio were in a league of their own, and they knew it. And when you meet another person who is of the same high caliber as yourself, it creates a sense of curiosity. You want to reach out to that other person and figure out what makes them think. Because in doing so, it is a mirror onto oneself. Now, luckily, I'm not the only person that has this opinion. Barry Strauss, the author of Masters of Command, focuses pretty heavily on this meeting, and he's got some great insight. Quote, Hannibal had another more personal agenda. He cared what Scipio thought of him. He didn't want Scipio basing his opinions of him on Carthaginian political slander, but wanted him to see the real Hannibal, and to see him now before the battle while they were still equals. Strauss goes on, quote, Meeting with Scipio was a gesture of respect, the equivalent of two boxers touching gloves before the bout. It was a bow to the unwritten code of conduct among fellow warriors. End quote. This is not that different than our two World War II aviators saluting one another, giving recognition to the other person's abilities. Now Strauss goes on, quote, The meeting was a way of hinting to Scipio that he and Hannibal had much in common. They were opponents, not enemies, and they could be useful to each other. The meeting was a strategic masterstroke. Hannibal was thinking not only of the field at Zama, but also of the post-war world. If Hannibal won, he could exploit a personal relationship with Scipio. If he lost, Scipio might help Hannibal avoid the fate of being shipped off to Italy to march in a Roman victory parade. Finally, there was history. Hannibal knew that if he died in battle and Rome won the war, the enemy would write the history books. When Scipio was later interviewed, Hannibal wanted him to remember the man he had met before battle. End quote. The very next day was the Battle of Zama, and the fate of Carthage would be decided. But wait a minute, how on earth did we get to this point? I mean, after all, in our last episode we left off with a very triumphant Hannibal with a victorious Carthaginian army on Italian soil after he had just defeated the largest army Rome could muster. So it makes sense to start in the aftermath of the Battle of Cannae. The date is August 2nd in the year 216 BCE, and folks, just for the record, all dates are going to be before the Common Era unless specified otherwise. On that day, Rome suffered one of the worst military disasters in her history. In fact, to call it a bit of a disaster is a kind of an understatement. I mean, 50 to 60,000 Roman dead in a single day, 17,000 captured, 80 senators, 29 tribunes gone. Even one of their consuls, Paulus, died in that battle. Brian Caven, the author of the Punic Wars, actually comments on this, quote, The most serious damage done by Cannae was to the myth of Roman invincibility. Cannae had been a formal trial by combat between the Roman Confederation and Hannibal, and the outcome seemed to indicate that Rome could not contain the invader or defend her allies. End quote. So what are the ramifications of such a massive military defeat? Well, several thousand Roman soldiers did manage to escape this battle. Amongst them was a much younger and I would say much more naive Publius Cornelius Scipio. As I call him, Scipio Jr., because his father, who was a consul, had the exact same name. Now, these men find their way back to Rome, where there is a state of complete panic. But what do you expect? I mean, Hannibal and his victorious Carthaginian horde is only a few hundred miles away. They're going to come right at us. They're going to climb right over our walls, jump into our city, murder us all. I mean, how quickly can I pack? Cannae was like a stone that you throw through a pane of glass. It leaves a big hole, but at the same time, it shatters everything around it. This shatter-like effect rippled through all Roman imperial landholdings. Everything that Rome had fought desperately to obtain began falling apart. And imagine yourself in the senatorial chamber. You're a senator or a consul of Rome at the time, and you're getting these reports, one after the other, of everything that you're beginning to lose. And it probably went something like this. Imagine yourself as a tribune giving a report to the senatorial committee. Excuse me, sirs, I don't mean to interrupt, but I've got some very distressing news from the front lines. First and foremost, the Gauls in northern Italy in the Po Valley have all gone into open revolt. They've gone ahead and slaughtered our 2 legions up there, and they managed to capture the leader of those legions, but instead of making negotiations with him, they've decided to hollow out his skull and use it as some sort of a drinking cup. Weird, I know, right? Also, large portions of southern Italy have defected to Hannibal's side. This includes areas of Samnium, Bruttium, Apulia, even Campania. And don't take this the wrong way, but the second largest city in Italy, Capua, has decided to make a formal alliance with Hannibal. Don't try to get in contact with the local Romans that used to live there. They've all been rounded up, put into a bathhouse, and asphyxiated. Bummer. Oh, by the way, Sardinia is in the beginnings of revolt. Sicily is beginning to break away. Syracuse, which was once our really good friend and ally, is, well, I don't think you can trust them anymore. They decided to defect to the Carthaginians. Oh, and nearly forgot, there's an uprising in Macedonia. The Illyrian coast is under threat. And FYI, the tribes in Spain are all rising up and trying to kick us out, and the Barcas that are living there have decided to raise another army to attack us. I think that's about all I got. Can you imagine being a senator or a consul of Rome and getting news like that? How do you respond? Where do you even begin? How does a civilization even recover from something like this? You've just been given notice of the worst military disaster in your history. Your imperial landholdings throughout your quote-unquote empire are starting to fall apart. And the Carthaginians in southern Italy hold the initiative. Now here's the part that's a little unusual. Hannibal decides not to march on Rome. And this, by the way, is one of those great what-ifs in history. What if Hannibal had decided to march on Rome right then and there in the aftermath of Cannae? Now, I personally don't think he would have been able to take the city. The walls were too impregnable, Rome was too large, and Hannibal's army was not big enough. Plus, siege warfare at this point in time was very rudimentary. But perhaps the psychological effect of having a victorious Carthaginian army at the gates of Rome in the aftermath of such a massive military disaster may have been enough to break up the Roman Confederation. But we're never gonna know. Hannibal opted to stay in southern Italy to rest and relax and secure the area, and this bought the Roman Senate just a little bit of time. And the Romans, being a pragmatic people, maximized on this gift. When Hannibal and his army failed to materialize, the panic factor began to subside, and then the Romans got to work. They elected a dictator. They firmly adopted the Fabian strategy. If you recall, this was the idea of not directly attacking Hannibal, but using attritional warfare to wear him and his troops down. And then they started to rebuild their forces. Adrian Goldsworthy gives an account of just how desperate the Romans were. Quote, "Within a short time, the Romans started to recover from the shock and take practical measures to rebuild their strength. A levy was carried out to form new legions, enrolling many 17-year-olds and even younger soldiers. Qualifications for military service was lowered to include poor citizens. Soon, there were at least 4 legions at Rome." Goldsworthy continues, quote, "An appeal was made to the slave households of citizens promising freedom on discharge. Men were provided from criminals awaiting punishment and debtors, all of whom were promised amnesty if they were willing to fight. Equipment was in short supply, so the Romans went to the temples of the city, stripped them of the many trophies of foreign armor and weapons from past triumphs, giving the newly raised troops a motley appearance." End quote. If Rome had a superpower, that power would be to mobilize its almost inexhaustible manpower supply. Think about this. In early 215, just a few months after Cannae, Rome had 12 to 14 legions in the field, and that number kept getting bigger and bigger. 5 years later, it had 25 legions in the field. That's 250,000 men under arms. You don't see numbers like this until the industrial age. And what's more, Rome had this insatiable desire to continue fighting. After Cannae, there wasn't any peace negotiation. There wasn't no white flag to Hannibal, we give up. No, none of that. Rome went so far as to impose these almost insanely harsh, I would say even draconian measures on its own people. All of the captives that Hannibal had after the Battle of Cannae, and you're talking several thousand people here, Rome decided not to ransom them. In fact, it went so far as to forbid its own private citizens from ransoming their fathers and brothers and sons. And the survivors of Cannae, the ones that actually managed to make it out of there and return to Rome, they didn't come back to a hero's welcome. They weren't refitted and thrown back into the field to continue the fight against Carthage. No, these men were rounded up, placed into 2 legions, and then shipped off to Sicily to begin an exile that would last for years. Hannibal quickly realized that taking on the Roman Republic was not going to be your standard smash and grab. This was going to be a long war. He needed to bring in new troops and new supplies. He needed to secure new allies. And initially, he was fairly successful with this. Like I had mentioned, vast tracts of southern Italy came under his control. The second largest city, Capua, entered into a formal alliance with him, and he used Capua as a great base of operations. Now, that said, these new landholdings turned out to be a mixed blessing. On one end, they would provide Hannibal with supplies, sometimes with new recruits. However, the new Italian recruits were kind of weak. They weren't used to fighting. The new Italian city-states that he would take over weren't used to self-rule. And what's more, Hannibal and his army, elite as they were, there was only one of them. And they were designed around the concept of mobile warfare, to hit and run, hit and run. And now suddenly you have all this territory that needed protecting. So you can see how these areas soon became a liability, especially when the Republic was rebuilding and rebuilding in vastly large numbers. Hannibal's response was to do 2 things. He needed to bring in troops, but more importantly, he needed to have a port to bring them in on. So he went after the nearest port that he could find, which was the city of Naples. Now, he attacked Naples twice. He got repulsed twice. Again, not so good with the whole siegecraft thing, but to his credit, eventually he was able to take the city of Tarentum, but more on that later. The other thing that he did was send his brother Mago back to Carthage in order to bring in the really good Carthaginian troops. After all, he knew that if you're going to fight, you might as well fight with the good stuff, right? Mago's return to Carthage, however, is one of those moments in history that's truly heartbreaking, at least to me. You can tell that Mago isn't just devoted to his brother. He has absolute adoration for the man. And when he appears before the Carthaginian Senate, he makes Hannibal out to be like Superman. Look what he's done. He's managed to cross the Alps. He's descended into Italian soil. He's taken on Roman army after Roman army and has smashed them. He eats tribunes and senators and consuls for breakfast. The guy is unstoppable. And look what we have. Capua is now one of our cities. Vast areas in Italy are in total revolt. Mago pleads for reinforcements. Livy actually brings this plea to life. Quote, that the nearer the prospect was of bringing the war to a conclusion, the more should Hannibal be aided by every means, for that the seat of war was at a long distance from home and in the heart of the enemy's country. End quote. And then, based on Hannibal's idea, Mago does this dramatic thing to add a certain degree of flair to an already heightened situation. He takes baskets of gold rings and he pours them out onto the Carthaginian Senate floor. And there's thousands of these rings and they go everywhere. But these aren't just ordinary rings. They're cut from the fingers of Roman soldiers at the Battle of Cannae. And not just your average soldier. They're all from the aristocracy. Mago's point is pretty clear. We haven't just defeated these people. We've decapitated them, and if there's ever a time to strike, it's now. But here is the really heartbreaking point. Mago is talking to a very hostile audience. The man in charge of the Carthaginian Senate is named Hanno, who's how do we say this politely, never really had very much love for the Barcas. Hanno has always been in charge of the peace faction. The way he figures, this entire war is Hannibal's baby. Hannibal started it, he can finish it. Why do the rest of us Carthaginians need to get involved in this madman's war? Livy actually has an account of Hanno's response to Mago. It's classic, but 2 points. I've paraphrased it for brevity, and if there is ever such a thing as a sarcasm meter, the thing would be going off the scale and starting to smoke about now. Quote, Hanno replied, I should have remained silent this day amid the general joy. But now, to a senator asking whether I still regret the undertaking of the war against the Romans, I may answer, therefore, that I have not ceased to regret the war, nor shall I cease to censure your invincible general until I see the war concluded on some tolerable terms, nor will anything except a new peace put a period to my regret for the loss of the old one. However, let us see what kind of war it is even now. And this is the part where Hanno gets really nasty. Quote, I have slain the armies of the enemy, yet you ask me, send me more soldiers. What else would you ask if you had been conquered? I have captured 2 of the enemy's camps, full, of course, of booty and provisions, yet you ask, supply me with more corn and money. What else would you ask had you been plundered and stripped of your camp? And that I may not be the only person perplexed, I wish that Mago could answer me this, for it is just and fair that I should put forth a question. Since the Battle of Cannae annihilated the Roman power, and it is a fact that all Italy is in a state of revolt, has any one of the Latin Confederacy come over to us? Has any individual of the 35 tribes deserted to Hannibal? Have they offered us peace? To which Mago looks down at his feet, looking all dejected, and responds, no to everything. To which Hanno concludes, quote, we have on our hands, then, war as entire as we had on the day Hannibal crossed into Italy. End quote. So tragically, the Carthaginian High Command's response is to drag as much tail as possible when it comes to any type of resupply or reinforcement of Italy. And as Hannibal, again, he's an elite warrior with an elite army, but there's only one of them. And when you're getting no reinforcements, and the Republic is massively revamping its military forces, what you have done is taken Italy and turned it into the world's largest game of whack-a-mole. You know, Hannibal goes from place to place to place, capturing cities along the way, but when he's gone, the Romans simply move in his wake and just basically recapture it. And this process gets repeated again and again ad nauseum. Now, for those of you who are interested in the play-by-play account, I recommend you read Livy. We, on the other hand, are going to leave the world's largest game of whack-a-mole behind and move on to the Sardinian front. We're going to move through this front fairly quickly. Sardinia was the proverbial kick in the crotch to the Carthaginians. It was taken, quote-unquote, illegally by the Romans between 240 and 238, which I'd like to add happened after the First Punic War ended. Rome took advantage of an uprising that landed troops, planted their flag, and then, poof, it became a Roman territory. But there was still a large pro-Carthaginian faction on the island, and it was not that surprising that in lieu of all the Roman military defeats that Hannibal had inflicted, that this group decided to rise up and rebel. Sardinia was a little like what Guadalcanal was to the Second World War. You know, it was one of the first major confrontations between the two big powers. It was kind of on the fringe of other major fronts, and it was one of those situations where whoever got to the island the firstest with the mostest would win. Rome sent their fleet along with a man by the name of Titus Manlius Torquatus, and I'm probably saying that wrong. Carthage sent their fleet under the command of Hasdrubal the Bald. Now, the Carthaginian fleet sailed out proudly and right into a storm, and by the time they got their act together, the Romans were firmly entrenched on the island. Manlius Torquatus, again, you gotta love these Roman names, had about 23,000 men under his command, the size of a consular army. He landed on the island and moved quickly to the southern portion where he secured his base of operations around a town called Carolus. The Carthaginians landed a little to the north of that at a city called Cornus. The two armies approached one another. They did battle in the center of the island, but the Romans managed to get the upper hand. And before long, the Carthaginians were kicked out, and at that point, Sardinia came under the firm control of the Roman Senate. Now, the Romans had to fight a little bit longer there, but they had their first victory. And they were going to prove to be successful on other fronts, which brings us to Macedon. The First Macedonian War was fascinating, not so much from a military perspective, but from a diplomatic one. It's a prime example of how diplomacy, if used just right, at just the right time, will not only get you what you want, but will also completely screw around with your neighbors. However, to get a better understanding, you gotta get a little bit of the backstory. Greece, at this point in history, was divided up into three major political factions. In the north, you had the Macedonians. In central Greece, you had what was known as the Aetolian League. And in the southern portion of the country, in the Peloponnesus, you had what was known as the Achaean League. Now, much like that book, 1984, by George Orwell, these three factions were constantly fighting. And it would be a situation where Group A and B would make an alliance against C, and then B and C would make an alliance against A, and then it would be this back and forth type of thing. Betrayal, backstabbing, fighting your neighbor, that was just another day in the office for the Greeks. During the time of the Second Punic War, you had a young Macedonian king by the name of Philip V come to power. Now, Philip had made a peace treaty with his otherwise mortal enemy, the Aetolian League in central Greece, and found himself with a little bit of extra time and a free hand to declare war on somebody else. He had been eyeing the Illyrian coast for some time. The only problem is that the Romans had already moved into that area. Now, Illyria is what we would think of as the modern-day Balkans, along the Adriatic coast. Rome had moved into the area initially in 229, and it had fought vigorously for what it had. Over the years, it had built up a few cities, it had a couple of ports, and this is precisely what Philip wanted. The only thing is that Philip didn't want to enter into a war with Rome lightly. So when he heard about the disaster at Trasimene, he started building up his forces, especially his navy. And when he heard about the way Hannibal thrashed the Roman army at Cannae, he declared war. I guess he figured that if you're going to kick somebody, the best time to do it is when they're already down. So he sends an envoy to Hannibal to establish an alliance with him. He sends his envoy twice, and his delegation gets captured by the Romans twice. So at this point, the Romans know precisely what Philip is up to, and their response to this is absolutely brilliant. They send in the perfect man for the job, one Marcus Valerius Lavinus. Lavinus is given a handful of troops, about a legion or so. He takes them down to the city of Brundisium and then ships them across the Adriatic and arrives in Illyria. Now, he arrives just in the nick of time. Philip shows up with his Greek army. These two men battle it out, but Lavinus is able to hold on to a few key points. He's able to hold on to a city called Oricum, and Philip tries to take this thing out but is unsuccessful. Despite this setback, Philip is actually a very gifted commander. In 212, he returns with his Greek army and is able to take out the port city of Lysis, which effectively splits Roman landholdings in Illyria into two. And it's at this point that Lavinus realizes that playing the military card may not be his best option. He figures that the Greeks know the territory pretty well. They can run and hide when they want to. They can attack and ambush us when they want to. This may not be the best option. Lavinus, at this point, has been in Illyria for quite some time, long enough to realize just how fractured the Greeks are. And in 211, he brilliantly plays on the fears of the local political establishment. He bypasses Philip altogether, and he goes to the Aetolian League, again the mortal enemy of Philip in the past. And he points out to them, hey, Philip is doing whatever he wants. He's attacked us. He's taken a couple of our cities. He's taken the port city of Lysis. Are you going to let him get away with this? And it's at this point that Lavinus astutely sweetens the deal. He tells the Aetolian League, hey, you know what? You guys can bring in whoever you want into this fight. Go out there, recruit, go nuts. And if you guys win, you can split the plunder amongst yourselves. And then he adds, by the way, if Philip beats us, he's probably going to go after you next. And at that point, he has said exactly the right thing. The Aetolians figure, hey, this is a great opportunity. Philip is already fighting the Romans. This is the perfect time to stab him in the back. And so they declare war on him. But then they take it a step further. They start bringing in other city-states. First, the city of Elis joins them, then Sparta, then Pergamum, And while this is all going on, the Achaean League, if you recall our fellow Greeks down the Peloponnesus, see all this and they start getting worried. They fear that if Philip falls, that the balance of power is going to get really disrupted, and so they join into the fight on Philip's side. And before you know it, you have Greeks fighting Greeks all over the country. Levinus had created one of the biggest clusters ever, and he knew it. When he returned to Rome in 211 to assume his consulship, he actually petitioned the Senate to demobilize Roman troops that were in Greece. He figured that Philip would have his hands full with his countrymen. And here's the thing, he was absolutely right. The rest of the First Macedonian War turned into a Greek versus Greek affair. Now granted, the armies weren't as big as the ones that were fighting in Italy. They were about 4,000 to 5,000 strong, but it was still a pretty vivacious event. The Romans, for their part, sat back, stoked the fires whenever they needed to be stoked, drank their wine, and basically watched the Greeks massacre one another. As for our young king Philip V, well, he never got a chance to meet up with Hannibal. He was too busy fighting on multiple fronts at home for that ever to happen. But here's the thing, like I had mentioned before, he was a very able commander. He started winning battle after battle, and eventually the balance of power actually started shifting towards him. And this culminated with his decisive victory over the Spartans in 207 at a place called Mantinea. But after this, Philip figured that, he'd played his cards to the most extent that they could, and he didn't want to push his luck. And so in 205, he sued for peace with the Romans, and in a moment of exquisite generosity, the Romans granted it to him. Because, let's face it, the Romans had bigger fish to fry. But here's the thing, Rome was not one to forget. Robert O'Connell, in his book, The Ghosts of Cannae, brings this home. Quote, "For Philip, the alliance with Hannibal had been Hellenistic business as usual. For Romans, a stab in the back which would be avenged. For mainland Greeks, Macedonians, and all the rest, this Cannae-inspired treaty with Hannibal was a disaster of the first order, marking the beginning of the end of their independence. Once drawn into the Greeks' affairs, the Romans would not leave them alone." End quote. All right, so with Greek proceedings being concluded, temporarily at least, we move on to Sicily, which is perhaps one of my favorite theaters of operation. From a historical perspective, there is a ton of stuff to say about Sicily. If you watch that movie Patton, he talks about how Sicily is the most conquered island in history. And he relates all these people that have taken it out, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Byzantine, the Arabs, etc., all the way down the line. During the time of the First Punic War, it was the focal point of aggression. Rome and Carthage slogged over this island for years. And to what end? They exhausted themselves from a military, naval, and economic standpoint. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into it right here and now. There's some previous episodes that you can listen to, hint, hint, or there's a ton of other references out there. Take your pick. In the end, Rome was triumphant. She owned most of the island, with the exception of the southeast corner, which was the independent city-state of Syracuse. Syracuse had a privileged position in the outcome of the First Punic War because she was Rome's mascot during the war. Her king, Hiero, was a big fan of Rome. He supplied Romans with troops and supplies and a base of operations. In fact, a lot of historians say that the Romans probably wouldn't have been quite so successful if it hadn't have been for Syracusan loyalty. Hiero manages to rule Syracuse for a considerable amount of time. But as they say, on a long enough timeline, everybody's survival rate drops to zero, and in the initial phases of the Second Punic War, Hiero passes away. He's succeeded by his son, who disappears under, let's call it, mysterious circumstances, and then is succeeded by his grandson, Hieronymus, who is not such a big fan of the Romans. In fact, in 215, in the aftermath of the Battle of Cannae, Hieronymus starts secret negotiations with Hannibal. Hannibal's response is to dispatch an envoy to the city. Hieronymus is never able to get in contact with these people, because 13 months after he comes to power, he's assassinated. His uncle, Adranodorus, assumes power, becomes king, and then is also promptly assassinated. Becoming king of Syracuse was a very dangerous prospect, and I want you to remember this because this plays into the story later down the line. So what you have in Syracuse is a power vacuum. And it is onto this that our Carthaginian envoy arrives. Two men, Hippocrates and Epicides, arrive at the island. They're brothers. They were actually exiled from Syracuse. They settled in Carthage, and Hannibal figured that they were the perfect men to establish good relations. Now, some people would call them opportunists. I personally think of them as political entrepreneurs. I'll let you decide. When they arrive at the island, they figure out that there is a power vacuum. They try to assume control, but they are rebuffed from Syracuse. And as they are marching away from Syracuse, they find a bunch of troops. They rally these troops to their side, and then march to the north and take out a small town called Leontini, which they use as a base of operations. From this town, they start raiding the Sicilian countryside. They start hitting Roman targets, outposts and base and that type of thing. And this, of course, catches the Senate's attention. In 214, the Senate dispatches a Marcus Claudius Marcellus along with an army. Marcellus lands near Messina and then promptly marches down on Leontini, which he takes with direct assault. Hippocrates and Epicides are, as you would think, in a bad spot at this point. I mean, what do you do when your base of operations is gone, right? So they take whatever soldiers they have left, and in a feat of luck and daring, they march back on Syracuse, they murder their opposition, and in an expeditious coup d'etat, they assume control of the city. But here's the thing, our daring duo couldn't stop there. They surmise, and surmise correctly, that the Romans are going to need to march on Syracuse. After all, Syracuse is the jewel of the island. You can't take Sicily unless you've got Syracuse. So Hippocrates and Epicides get to work. They start mobilizing the population and recruiting troops, and their work is made a little bit easier because, as I had mentioned to you before, becoming king of Syracuse was a hazardous prospect. And so, over the successive generation of one paranoid king after the other, the defenses of the city had really been built up. The city walls were very tall. They had these towers everywhere. One side of the city was on the ocean, another side faced this swampy area. And then onto this, to make things a little bit more interesting, you throw a rocket scientist. Or at least a 3rd century equivalent of a rocket scientist, because you see, in the city of Syracuse lived a man named Archimedes. He was a profound mathematician. He was an exquisite physicist. And then on top of that, he was a designer of weapons. Archimedes is who, in my mind, is what you get when you mix someone like Leonardo da Vinci with Oppenheimer, and then you throw in a little bit of Newton for good measure. The weapon systems that he came up with were arguably hundreds of years ahead of their time. When the Romans marched on Syracuse, they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. This wasn't just a well-defended town. This wasn't just a fortified city. They were going up against a fully operational battle station, and they had no idea. Marcellus and his army arrive at the gates of Syracuse in late 214. They begin to lay siege. They figure that they're going to take the city by direct assault because, of course, that's what Romans do. When in doubt, use more brute strength. If the round peg doesn't fit into the square hole, it means you just got to hit it a little harder. Well, I will give credit to where it's due. Marcellus did come up with an ingenious two-pronged assault. He was going to attack the city both by land and also by sea. And the seaward approach, he took 4 of his ships, lashed them together in order to build siege towers, which is creative. But when he launched his attack, he realized exactly what he was going up against. The landward attack came from the north. As the Roman troops started marching closer to the city, they started getting hit by a bunch of arrows. And I'm talking different shapes and sizes. Some of them were so massive that they could skewer an entire line of men in one go. Archimedes had built what we would consider to be ballistas. Think of a giant crossbow that's mounted to the ground and launches a 50-pound arrow, and there were tons of these. What's more, they came in a bunch of different sizes because Archimedes wanted to hit the Romans at a variety of different ranges. And being a mathematician, he could figure out the trajectory, so he knew exactly how to hit them. For the poor guys that managed to make it past the arrows, well, then they had to deal with the catapults. And I'm not talking about your average run-of-the-mill catapults. I'm talking about what would be considered to be proto-trebuchets. Catapults on steroids, able to launch a payload so massive that when they came down, it would squash an entire group of men. And if you recall, the Romans liked to put their men into those square maniples, which were the perfect targets. Now, if you were lucky enough to actually make it up to the city walls, there's even reports that Archimedes figured out a way to roll boulders down the side of the walls. They would hit this ramp-like structure at the bottom and then go shooting forth and manage to just wipe out entire lines of men. This turned into a disaster of an attack. And the seaward side, it didn't do any better. The ships that were coming in, they had to deal with the ballistas and the catapults, but then they had to deal with something that was known as the Archimedes Claw. I mean, even the name itself inspires fear. As I had previously mentioned, Archimedes wasn't just a mathematician, he was also really big into physics. And he understood the concept of the fulcrum and lever, the principles that make a crowbar so successful. And what he had done was he had placed a grapple-like device at the end of a very long lever. This thing could come down and grab not just one, but a bunch of ships. And then the men inside of the city would use the lever to hoist the ship up to a pretty decent altitude, at which point they would release it. Now, if you were on board this ship and the fall didn't kill you, the capsizing of the ship and the influx of water would most likely make you drown. And this device was used over and over and over again. And if that's not enough, there are stories out there, and that may be all it is just a story, or it might be apocryphal or made up. But Archimedes was big into parabolas. And he kind of figured out that if you take a bunch of mirrors and you lined them up along the city walls, and you adjusted them in such a way to concentrate the sun's rays to a focal point, that may be enough to ignite sails or ships or people on fire. In essence, a death ray. Again, this was a fully operational battle station, right? So I guess it would be safe to say that the attack from sea, kind of like the attack from land, was a miserable disaster. Marcellus kind of sort of learned his way. He changed his tactics. From here on, he was going to barricade the city in and try to starve them out, but every once in a while he would send in an assault. And of course, this would be met with just miserable success. In fact, it got to the point where when his soldiers approached the city and they would see some random beam of wood sticking out from the ramparts, it would be enough to invoke terror. The siege of Syracuse dragged on. In fact, the Carthaginian government took advantage of this. They sent an army to the island under the command of a General Himilco, who successfully landed near the city of Agrigentum, which is in the middle of the island on the southern coast. Now, this posed a huge problem for Marcellus, who was stuck between the siege of Syracuse on one end and this incoming Carthaginian force on the other. Marcellus was able to masterfully detach his forces from the siege, march out, attack Himilco, and while he wasn't able to destroy the incoming Carthaginian force, he was able to damage it enough to render it basically useless. He was able to return to his siege without any further interruptions. And when he got back, he was taught through informants of a possible way of getting into the city. He was told that the festival of Artemis was coming up, and if the Syracusans liked to do anything, it was to party. So he sat back and he waited for the festivities to begin. Meanwhile, in the city, the food situation was getting kind of desperate. There wasn't enough bread. Again, the city was under blockade. Epicides, who was in charge of the city, decided to dispense extra rations of wine to compensate for the lack of bread, and you can kind of figure out how that one's going to play out. In the middle of the night, the Romans came and attacked. Now, the defenders of Syracuse had gotten very complacent for two main reasons. One, because they were very confident in the defense mechanisms that Archimedes had installed, and number two, they were really, really trashed. So, the Romans managed to scale the walls. They got to the hexapylon gate in the north portion of the city and opened it up, and they quickly secured a bunch of other strategic locations. And before you know it, the Roman soldiers were just pouring into the city. The Syracusans had no choice. They began to retreat, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, to the citadel in the southern portion of the city, but even that didn't last for very long. Marcellus had picked just the right time to capture Syracuse, because just as he was finishing up his conquest, the relief force under Himilco arrived before the city walls. Now, this Carthaginian force made the mistake of camping out in a swampy area, and according to the references, the plague descended on their camp, and before you know it, most of the Carthaginians were wiped out. It was also at this point that a naval expedition from Carthage arrived. But seeing that the city was not exactly in Carthaginian hands, a fleet of 700 merchantmen and 150 warships decided to basically abandon the city and turn around. Now, whatever happened to Archimedes? Well, the Romans were given explicit instructions to bring him back alive. And the Roman centurion that found him in the citadel of Syracuse found him scribbling away on a piece of paper. And when he demanded that Archimedes get up and follow him right now, Archimedes' response was to wave his hand in his face and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to finish this mathematical problem first. I can almost see this in my mind. Archimedes is probably having one of his eureka moments where he gets up and he's all excited and jumping up and down. And he says, you know what? I got it. I figured it out. The grand unifying theory that defines everything is as simple as his following equation. It's ugh. At which point the Roman spears him through with his sword. The rest of the Sicilian campaign is going to be one unfortunate downhill slide for the Carthaginians. In 212, Marcellus is able to complete his conquest of Syracuse. In 211, he returns back to Rome and he steals any little bit of artwork that's not nailed down. In fact, some historians go so far as to say that this is where the Romans initially got their love of Greek art. Now, the Carthaginians continue to try. They still hold on to a few key locations like Agrigentum, and from time to time they send in reinforcements, but this is basically a losing theater of operation. In the end, whoever owns Syracuse is going to win. In 210, the Roman Senate gets really serious. They send in Marcus Valerius Laevinus. If you recall, Laevinus was our hero in Macedonia. He comes in and he does the masterful work of incorporating the Cannae legions into his armed forces. If you recall, those were the poor guys that were exiled to Sicily in the first place. Now, with their help, Laevinus is able to kick the Carthaginians out of Agrigentum and a bunch of other strongholds, and eventually he's able to kick Carthage out of Sicily for good. Laevinus eventually returns to Rome to a hero's welcome, and to his credit, he attempts to reincorporate the Cannae legions back into the general armed forces, but the Senate doesn't want to hear anything of it. And so our poor Cannae legions are left in Sicily, in exile, waiting for a chance at redemption. And with that, the curtain closes on Sicily. So up until now, we've been talking very highly about the Barcas, and it's really hard not to. After all, they were Carthage's saving grace. Hamilcar was able to get Carthage through the mercenary wars and establish a presence in Iberia, and of course his son Hannibal was one of the greatest military minds of all time. But what about Rome? It seems like Rome was fraught with military commanders that were just the epitome of mediocrity. And Roman tactics were this kind of mixture of brute strength with more brute strength. Again, trying to ram that round peg into a square hole was the way to go. Now, this all changes in Spain. Spain was a hodgepodge of different tribal groups that were all trying to eke out their existence. There were three main tribal groups. In the western portion of the country, in what we would consider to be Portugal now, you'd have the Lusitanians. In the southeastern portion, you'd have the Iberians. And in the north, you had the Celt Iberians. Now, the take-home message is that these tribal groups would back up whoever they felt was the strongest. Whether that be Rome or Carthage, it depended on who was going to win. So you had this very labile loyalty. Keep that in mind. At the beginning of the Second Punic War, the Barcas owned a tremendous amount of territory in southeastern Spain. They had silver mines and a recruiting operation. Their capital, New Carthage, which is modern-day Cartagena, was a jewel of a city. And this was something that the Romans weren't too happy about. And so in 218, the Senate sent a consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, in order to put an end to Carthaginian dominance in the area. Now, if you recall, Scipio made it as far as the Rhone River in southern France, where he discovered that Hannibal was already on the move. Scipio made the disastrous decision to divide up his forces. He himself went back to Italy, where he was promptly defeated by Hannibal, but his brother Gnaeus took the other half of the army, approximately 20,000 men, and moved onwards towards Spain. Gnaeus managed to land his forces at the city of Emporion, which is located near the modern-day border of Spain and France, and then began recruiting the locals. Now, like I said before, the locals' loyalty was kind of up for grabs. When he had a sufficient amount of force, he moved deeper into the Iberian Peninsula and met up with a Carthaginian force at an area called Sissa, where he promptly defeated this force and then moved on to establish a very strong foothold at the city of Tarraco, which, if you're interested, is the modern-day city of Tarragon. During this time, when Hannibal was off and away to fight the Romans, he left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Spanish operations. Now, you gotta love Hasdrubal. You know, the guy tried really, really, really hard, but the problem is that he didn't have his brother's insight or daring or talent when it came to military endeavors, and he comes across as being the comedy relief of the Barca clan. I almost feel sorry for him because everything that he endeavors to do just kind of blows up in his face. Hasdrubal does the dutiful thing of trying to send a combined land and sea expedition against the Romans. They meet up at the river Ebro, but this is going to turn into a total disaster. His land forces accomplish very little. His naval forces, after an initial skirmish with the Romans, basically run away. In fact, the Carthaginian vessels beached themselves along the shore in order to find some sort of protection with the land forces, and when the Romans see this, they just pull up and tow away the abandoned Carthaginian vessels, adding them to their own fleet, saying, hey, thanks for the freebies, suckers. In late 217, after recovering from wounds inflicted at the river Ticinus, Publius Cornelius Scipio arrives in Spain with some Roman reinforcements. The Scipio brothers are invested by the Roman Senate with proconsular imperium, which means they're given carte blanche in order to continue all hostilities that are deemed necessary for the duration. Once the Scipios, the Scipi, once the Scipi have this power, they decide to move with it. They increase their sphere of influence, they bring in more troops, they even go so far as to march on the city of Saguntum. Now, what is Hasdrubal doing while all this is happening? Well, our little Barca has got himself his hands full, taking on tribal rebellions. But our boy has got himself a plan. Once he gets done putting down all these rebellions, which happens in about 215, he decides to take his newly minted army, add on a few more reinforcements, and then march all the way to Italy in order to join up with his brother. But here's the thing. The Romans learn about this plan, and there's no way they can allow this to happen. If the Barcas join up, from a military perspective, that would be a complete and total disaster. And so the Scipi move in to intercept, and both armies meet at a place called Ibera. The Battle of Ibera in 215 is an example of what happens when you employ tactics that are, well, I would say very similar to what were used at Cannae, except that the battle just goes horribly wrong. Hasdrubal took his weakest units to act kind of like a target and put them right in the center. And then he flanked these with his Carthaginian and African infantry to flank whatever was going to be coming in. And then, of course, on the sides, he had the cavalry and the elephants. Now, the Romans did exactly the opposite. They took their best units, the Roman legions, and then put them in the center, flanked those with their Italian allies, and then on the sides, they had their cavalry as well. When the battle began, Hasdrubal ordered his cavalry into a charge to attack their Roman counterparts, but unlike Cannae, the cavalry was not able to drive the Romans from the field of battle. It turned into an inconclusive clash of horsemen. And while this was going on, the Roman legions plowed right into the center of the Carthaginian line. Now, the Spaniards were able to hold on for a little while. They put up a bit of resistance, but in the end, they started falling back. And then they broke. When the center of your line breaks like this, it's going to be a disaster. The Romans poured through the gap, and then the Carthaginian and African infantry that were now isolated found themselves flanked and then later enveloped. The Carthaginian cavalry did very little, the elephants did even less, and the Carthaginian infantry found themselves starting to retreat panic, and then it became a total rout. This was a decisive Roman victory on several different levels. On a tactical level, we don't know exactly how many casualties there were, but obviously it must have favored the Romans. An entire Carthaginian army was wiped out. Now, Hasdrubal did manage to make it back to New Carthage with most of his cavalry and a little bit of his infantry, but they weren't going to pose much of a resistance at this point. And on a bigger picture, on a strategic level, that army was not able to link up with Hannibal. Now, it gets even worse. When the Carthaginian high command discovered this, they took Mago, and if you remember, Mago was back in Carthage begging for reinforcements. They actually gave him an army that was scheduled to go to Italy to help out in that front, but when they discovered this disaster in Spain, they rerouted Mago to Spain to stabilize the situation there instead. And so Hannibal wasn't depleted of just one reinforcing army, but two. Ibera is a great what-if scenario in history, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what would have happened had that battle gone the other way. 215 to 211 was a period of steady progress for the Romans. While the Carthaginians still held on to a lot of territory, they also had to deal with more of the locals and their rebellious nature, especially in wake of a defeat like Ibera, which only makes that rebellious nature more audacious. And it was because of this that the Carthaginian high command decided to pour even more troops into Spain. They dispatched yet another army, and this one under the command of a Hasdrubal Gisco. And by the way, the Giscos were a rival faction to the Barcas, and for the purposes to avoid confusion, we're just going to call them Gisco. While this was going on, the Romans were busy expanding their sphere of influence. The Scipio brothers, the Scipi, captured more territory, they made more allies, and in 212 they managed to retake the city of Saguntum. The Scipi went so far as to bring in a huge amount of Celtic Iberian mercenaries from the north. And with this revamped and rebuffed army, they felt secure enough that in 211 they decided to go for the gusto. They were going to invade the Barca heartland and try to kick the Carthaginians out of Spain once and for all. This audacious attack, on paper, made a lot of sense. Publius Cornelius Scipio waited for the Carthaginian forces to be divided up. Again, if you recall, there were now 3 Carthaginian armies that were operating independently in Spain under the commands of Hasdrubal, Mago, and Gisco. Once the Roman commander was sufficiently satisfied that the Carthaginian forces were far enough from one another, he sent the Roman army into an area known as the Tater River Valley. And once he got there, his plan started to fall apart. Publius Cornelius Scipio was a product of the old Roman system where you had to get as much glory as quickly as possible, and he decided to divide up his forces to attack all Carthaginian contingents at once. I think the thought process behind this was that if he did this, he might have the element of surprise and catch the Carthaginians unaware, or he could at least prevent the Carthaginians from joining together in one cohesive force. It probably would have made more sense to keep your army together and attack these contingents piecemeal, but, hindsight is 20/20. However, you can't entirely fault me for being an armchair general here. After all, the last time that Publius Cornelius Scipio divided up his forces, he was met with almost total disaster. The plan that he was going to come up with, by the way, was going to be no different. Publius Cornelius Scipio takes 2/3 of the Roman army and marches them towards the Baetis Valley, where Gisco and Mago have combined forces and are waiting for him. He sends his brother Gnaeus along with the new Celt Iberian troops towards Hasdrubal, who's located north of New Carthage. Right from the start, Publius's forces are detected and then come under the attack of Numidian horsemen that are commanded by a Massinissa. Now, we got to talk a little bit about Massinissa. He is an extremely captivating and fascinating character who also plays a very decisive role in the way that the Second Punic War is going to play out. Massinissa was the type of person that if he was on a team sport, he'd wear the t-shirt that says, "I got this." He was an MVP. And it wasn't just the fact that he was a very talented cavalry commander. He also had a high degree of charisma. He had the undying loyalty of his men. And then you throw on top of this his background, which is almost borderline romantic. He was a Numidian prince, exiled, fighting to regain his homeland. The type of person that people later write poems and songs about. But it wasn't all rainbows and flowers with this guy. I mean, he did have a dark streak. He had an agenda. He wanted to be king of Numidia, and he was going to back up whoever was going to give him that opportunity. So please keep that in mind. In 211, we find Massinissa working for the Carthaginians, doing a delaying action on Publius and the rest of his Roman contingent. And Massinissa was very successful with this. Publius found himself in some serious trouble. He got word that several of the Iberian tribes were rising up against him. He tried to send the Romans to attack him, he going so far as to try to attack the Iberians in the middle of the night. But all the time, the Numidians were there to slow him down. And then Publius found out that Mago and the Punic army had appeared in his rear, and in the ensuing battle, the Roman army was destroyed. And Publius Cornelius Scipio, consul of Rome, proconsular imperium of Spain, died. His brother Gnaeus didn't fare much better. Gnaeus was sent off to take on Hasdrubal, but before he was able to take on the Carthaginian, he woke up to find that 3/4 of his army had disappeared in the night. Hasdrubal had been in Spain a lot longer than Gnaeus, and he knew that the Celt-Iberian mercenaries that the Romans had hired were easily bribed. And that's exactly what he did. And for the Celt-Iberians, this wasn't considered a betrayal based on their customs, it was simply a business transaction. Gnaeus found himself with a fraction of the army that he once possessed. And with his brother dead and his brother's army defeated, he had no chance of any type of reinforcement. What's worse, there was nothing holding back all 3 contingents of the Carthaginian force from converging on his spot. Gnaeus attempted to retreat, but found himself almost completely surrounded, and instead had to make his last stand on a small hill called Lorsi. And he, of course, too, didn't survive this. This was going to be another example of where a confrontation between the Barcas and the Scipio resulted in the spilling of Scipio blood. With both Scipio brothers dead, the remaining Roman forces retreated to their strongholds north of the Ebro River. Now, the Carthaginians didn't pursue them. A lot of people feel that this was because of a lot of political infighting between the Barcas and the Giscos who couldn't come up with a concerted plan. Now, this was going to be a huge mistake because the Romans held on in Spain, and reinforcements were on the way. As one can imagine, the defeat of Roman forces and the death of the brothers Scipio was a major setback in the Roman war effort. The Senate needed someone to assume command in Spain, but when they sent out the call, nobody stepped forward. And why would you? Spain was this backwater theater. It was full of barbarians. It was essentially the edge of the world. But yet, the Senate kept trying. And again, nobody stepped forward until one day when one person raised their hand in the back of the crowd. And when the Senate asked this man to come forward, the man that entered into the Senate chamber was not exactly up to their expectations. He was young, too young. He had this swagger about his walk. He had this degree of confidence and charisma that bordered on almost arrogance. And worse, he had long hair. The old men in the Senate hated this man already. When they asked him his name, he responded, "I am Publius Cornelius Scipio." Here in front of the Senate was the very son of the man that had just died in Spain. Initially, the Senate wanted nothing to do with him. They figured he was too young, too inexperienced. He'd never had a command position before, and it was against the rules to have somebody this young in charge of an entire army. But Publius did the equivalent of going over their heads. He appealed to the comitia censurata, and they gave him the job. Now, our young Publius Cornelius Scipio, and folks, for the record, since his father and his uncle were both dead, we might as well just call him Scipio. And by the way, I really wanted to incorporate that line, the last of the Scipi would he be, but, he had a brother. In any case, our young Scipio had a lot of things going for him. First and foremost, he had an aristocratic name. Second of all the men that would have assumed command at this point were dead, as most of the aristocracy were wiped out at Cannae. And third, and perhaps the most important, nobody else wanted the job. And so Scipio packed up his stuff, took a small contingent of Roman soldiers, and traveled to Emporion, where he met up with the rest of the Roman forces that were already there. When all was taken into account, he had about 30,000 infantry and about 3,000 cavalry, and he started making preparations right away. So I would have to say that I'm not the only person that is a huge fan of this man. This is what Adrian Goldsworthy had to say, quote, Scipio was one of the most charismatic figures produced by the Romans during the Punic Wars. In many respects, he conformed to the ideal of the youthful military genius which has done much to shape Western ideas of heroicism since Alexander the Great. He was the familiar mixture of the man of action and the sensitive, intelligent lover of culture, particularly that of the Greek world. His operations were imaginative, bold, and aided by good fortune, so that it is sometimes easy to overlook the careful preparation and planning which underlay the sense of youthful impatience." End quote. The rest of 210 was a period of training for Scipio and his men. Scipio did this thing where he would emphasize training, drill, tactics above everything else. And by 209, he felt that he was ready. At this point, he did something that was a little unusual for a Roman. He sent out reconnaissance and he discovered that the Punic armies were well dispersed. His scouts informed him that Hasdrubal was near the modern-day city of Toledo fighting a Carpentani tribe, Mago was near the Pillars of Hercules, which is all the way down in Gibraltar, and Gisco was fighting the Lusitanians in what we would consider Portugal. The biggest problem, or opportunity, I guess, depending on which way you look at it, is that each one of these Carthaginian contingents is over a 10-day march to the capital. And Scipio picks up on this fact, and with that, he decides to attack New Carthage itself. Now, he manages to mobilize about 25,000 infantry, about 2,500 cavalry, and then he brings the Roman fleet along with him, which he places under the command of his good friend and competent commander, Gaius Laelius. The Romans move in secrecy, and they arrive suddenly and rapidly in front of the city. In fact, he does such a good job of this that he completely surprises the garrison of about 3,000 men that are defending New Carthage. Now, as I've previously described it, New Carthage was a jewel of a city. It was built on essentially an island. There was a small landward approach from the eastern side, and on the western side there were a couple of man-made bridges, but otherwise it was almost completely surrounded by water. In the north you had this lagoon, and in the south you had this deep water bay, which made New Carthage not only a great city, but also a really good port. Scipio's first action was to attack the city directly. He sent in his forces via the little land bridge on the eastern side. He had a diversionary attack on the western side, and then he sent the fleet in to attack the seaward wall. Now, this attack failed miserably, but it did manage to catch the attention of the garrison. And the very next day, instead of waiting the customary 1 week to rebuild his forces, he attacked the city again. But this time, the man had done his homework. He had learned from fishermen in Tarraco that the lagoon on the north portion of the city was something that could be crossed at the right time of day during low tide when the wind hit the water just right. And so he attacked the city in a direct frontal attack, but again, this was meant as a diversionary tactic. While the garrison was focusing all of its attention on the south and eastern walls, Scipio had sent a contingent of about 500 Romans to cross the lagoon, and with scaling ladders, they managed to climb over the northern wall, climb into the city, and hit the garrison from the rear. At this point, it became just a matter of time. The Carthaginians had to fall back, the Romans made it to the gate, opened it up for their compatriots, and before long, New Carthage was in the hands of the Romans. The fall of this city was going to be a massive blow against the Carthaginians. This wasn't just their capital, this was their base of operations. It was a place where they stockpiled war material. It was their treasury, their training center, not to mention the fact that there were nearby silver mines. And now, Scipio had a perfect springboard for a deeper invasion into Spain. Now let's talk about Scipio's tactics here. I mean, you have a Roman that's using reconnaissance and military intelligence and diversionary tactics in order to accomplish his goals in a very limited amount of time. And this is amazing stuff. Scipio was learning, and truly learning from the master. Brian Cavins, the author of the Punic Wars, writes this, quote, "Scipio had fought against Hannibal at the Ticinus, perhaps at Trebia, and definitely at Cannae. He had devoted, we may be sure, a great deal of thought to the identification of what it was, apart from the genius of the commander, that made the Punic army superior to the Roman. When he found himself with truly independent command, he set about transforming an army that had been regarded tactically as a single monolithic body of infantry with weak cavalry support into a composite body made up of heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry units, each of which might be required to maneuver independently on the field of battle." End quote. Now, also like Hannibal, Scipio trained a bunch of sub-commanders to also think and operate independently, but then at the same time fight as one. And he got a chance to use this new army in 208. It was in this year that Hasdrubal attempted to link up with his brother Hannibal again. He had built up another army, and when the Romans found out about this, they moved in to intercept, but this time Hasdrubal was going to play a little hard to get. Our beloved Carthaginian commander did everything he could this time to make sure that he had a great defensive position. He took his forces, put them on top of a hill. There was a ring of fortifications, and then he was flanked on two sides by a river. He had about 25,000 men along with his Iberian allies, and when Scipio discovered this, he was really dismayed because his opponent had such a strong position. But Scipio realized that the longer he waited to attack him, the more chance another Punic army would arrive. And so Scipio came up with an interesting plan. The Battle of Baecula, as it later was known as, started off with a direct frontal assault by Scipio's light infantry. The Velites were able to make a little bit of progress despite being hit by successive volleys of incoming missiles. But what it did do was distract Hasdrubal from what was really going on. Scipio was going to do a pincer attack. He had taken his heavy infantry and divided it up into two parts. He commanded the left flank, and he had his sub-commander Laelius command the right. Now, the training and discipline that he put into this really paid off. Both pincers were able to move in secrecy, and even when the Carthaginians did discover this, Hasdrubal did nothing about it. The two wings managed to get to the top of the hill and then clash directly into the flanks of the Carthaginian army. And when that happened, Hasdrubal, despite all of his preparation and defensive positions and high grounds and fortifications, found himself being routed from the field of battle. The Battle of Baecula turned into a tactical victory for the Romans, but a strategic defeat. While Scipio was able to inflict a lot of casualties, especially on the Carthaginian cavalry, the bulk of the Punic army managed to escape, and Hasdrubal took this army all the way to Italy in an attempt to link up with Hannibal, but more on that later. Now, just as an aside, one of the reasons why Scipio was also so successful was because of his legendary leniency. You know, when he took New Carthage, he left the aristocracy for the most part alone. And when he won at Baecula, he had a lot of enemy captives. Amongst them was a man by the name of Massiva, who turned out to be the nephew of our Numidian horseman, Massinissa. And Scipio tactfully let this man go. So what was the strategic situation at this point? I mean, what was the big picture in Spain like? Hasdrubal had left for Italy. Essentially, the only commanders left were Gisco and Mago, who promptly retreated to the city of Gades, which was the last Carthaginian stronghold in the southwest portion of the country. Well, Carthage decided to send in another army to support Spain, instead of supporting Hannibal. This army was discovered, ambushed, and destroyed by Scipio's new sub-commander, Silanus. And now the Carthaginians were really in a bad spot. Gisco, who's still stationed in the city of Gades, decides to build up a formidable army. And by that I mean 60,000 infantry, 4,500 cavalry, 32 elephants. He places Mago as his second-in-command and then assembles his forces to march out and take on Scipio. Scipio acknowledges him, and the two forces meet around the city of Alyppa, which is about 10 miles north of the modern-day city of Sevilla. Scipio's forces are not quite as formidable. He's got about 45,000 infantry and about 3,000 cavalry, but, that's just not going to stop him. And thus the stage was set for a pitched battle. The Battle of Alyppa in 206 was important for several different reasons. Aside from being a battle that would decide which way things were going to go between the Romans and Carthaginians in Spain, it also showed Scipio's evolution as a commander in his ability to maneuver and outthink his opponent. After all, Scipio had to come up with a way to take on an enemy that was larger than himself. So this is what he did. Both of the forces were arranged on two separate hills that were separated by a plain between them. and Scipio would arrange his forces, and the Carthaginians would do likewise, but Scipio wouldn't give the order to attack. He wanted the Carthaginians to see his battle formation and get used to it. Every morning, he would take his best troops, his legions, and put them in the center. He would take his new Spanish infantry, the mercenaries that he had just hired from the Iberian Peninsula, and put them on their flanks. And then on the extreme wings, he would have his cavalry and his velites, his light infantry. The Carthaginians did likewise. They put their Carthaginian infantry, their best troops in the center, flanked by their Spanish mercenaries, and then the cavalry and the elephants would be on the extreme wings. Now Scipio would wake up every morning, have his forces arrange themselves in the exact same battle formation, and the Carthaginians would do likewise, and then they would just stare off at each other. Neither side would give the command to attack, and this happened day after day after day, until, of course, the day that Scipio was actually ready to attack. On that morning, Scipio got his men up at the break of dawn, even earlier than that. He had them eat a very hearty meal, drink plenty of water, and then he sent his velites out to wake the Carthaginians up. The velites, the light infantry, managed to make their way all the way up to the Carthaginian camp because at this point the Carthaginians were getting a little complacent, at which point they showered the enemy camp with tons of javelins. When the Carthaginians finally woke up, they realized that the Romans were already in battle formation and they rushed themselves to get into formation, missing out on breakfast, missing out on drinking water, the whole spiel. Alyppa took place sometime in the summer. We're not exactly sure of the exact date, but we're talking southern Spain here, so it's obviously really hot outside. And Scipio used that to his advantage. He waited and let the day slowly pass by. He figured the longer he waited, the more the Carthaginians would sweat it out. When he finally figured that the Carthaginians were fatigued enough, he gave the order to attack. But here's the thing. Scipio had changed up his battle formation. He had placed his weakest units, the Spanish infantry, in the center, and he had taken his strongest forces, the Roman legions, divided them up into two groups, and had placed them on the Spanish flanks. When the Carthaginians saw this, they couldn't make heads or tails out of it. They didn't understand what kind of advantage he could possibly get out of this. And even if the Carthaginians wanted to change up their formation, they couldn't. They'd already assembled, and Scipio had given the command to attack. Now Scipio told his Spanish units to march slowly towards the Carthaginian center. While this was going on, he had the Roman legions on the wings move in quickly, and when they got within half a mile of the enemy, he sprung his trap. The Roman legions on the left flank turned 90 degrees to their left, and the Roman legions on the right flank turned 90 degrees to their right. And suddenly, these two blocks of soldiers turned into a column. And when you have a column, men can move faster. And at this point, the left flank moved quickly to the left, the right flank moved quickly to the right, and what Scipio was able to do was extend his forces beyond the flanks of his enemy. When the Roman legions were in a suitable location, Scipio gave the order, and both wings turned 90 degrees again to face the enemy, but now they were in a perfect position to flank the Carthaginians. Think about the amount of discipline that was required to move tens of thousands of men in a concerted effort like this. I mean, it's incredible. And the fact that he was able to make such an audacious move so close to the enemy, I mean, he was only half a mile away. Half a mile you could probably cross at a slow, leisurely walk in about 10 to 15 minutes. Brian Caven, again the author of the Punic Wars, talks about just how devastating this move was. Quote, "The center, the flower of the Punic army, was unable to play any part in the fighting. If it had gone forward to engage Scipio's center, it would have run the risk of being cut off from its camp by the collapse of the wings. If it had changed front so as to support the wings, it would have exposed its own flank to a devastating charge by Scipio's Spaniards. The heat of the day, their unfed condition, and the impaired confidence, for they were aware that the enemy had seized the initiative, all contributed to the defeat of Hasdrubal's men, whose fighting retirement degenerated first into full retreat and finally into total rout." End quote. The Battle of Alyppa effectively ends Carthaginian rule in Spain. Now granted, Gisco manages to make it back to Carthage, Mago manages to hold on a little bit longer in the city of Gades, but eventually Gades falls to treachery. Scipio, on the other hand, opens negotiations with Massinissa, who, let's face it, our Numidian prince has got himself an agenda, and he no longer has confidence that the Carthaginians are going to make him king. Now, what else is there to say about our Roman commander? Scipio spends a little bit more time in Spain solidifying his position, but the very next year, in 205, he returns to Rome to assume the consulship, thereby becoming one of the youngest consuls in Roman history. The Scipio have indeed returned. The Italy that Scipio returns to in 205 is vastly different than the one that he left. Rome is in a much stronger position. We've been kind of ignoring the Italian front up until this point, but it's probably a good idea we get back to it. Hannibal, as we had mentioned before, won at the Battle of Cannae. A lot of different portions of southern Italy defect to his cause. Capua becomes his base of operations, and then Hannibal desperately needs a port. He attacks Naples twice, doesn't succeed. And then, as the Carthaginians have kind of a lukewarm reception to the whole idea of warfare, he doesn't get the reinforcements that he needs, and the Italian front devolves into this attritional war state. You know, the Romans don't want to attack him directly. They're employing the Fabian strategy. They're going to try to starve him out, and this is going to be a long process. And as we described it before, it turns into this giant game of whack-a-mole. Hannibal has an elite, powerful army, but there's only one of them. He goes out, he captures a city or a territory, and then as soon as he moves on, the Romans move back in, and the process repeats itself over and over again. But despite these setbacks, Hannibal was not the type of person to quit. In 212, he marches his army out from Capua towards the port city of Tarentum. Again, he really needs to have a port in order to bring in supplies and reinforcements. Along the way, he bumps into an army under the command of Gnaeus Flaccus, who, defying the Fabian strategy, sends a smaller army of about 18,000 men to attack Hannibal. Of the 18,000 men that Flaccus sends in, only about 2,000 make it out. Flaccus is fired for gross incompetence, and the poor men under his command are exiled to Sicily to join the Cannae legions in exile. Now again, Hannibal is a very lethal force. This Battle of Herdonia, as it was later known, repeats itself again in 210, where another general decides to do the same thing with the exact same results. When our Carthaginian commander arrives at the city of Tarentum, he employs the tried and true method of waiting for everybody in the city, all the Romans, to be completely drunk, and then having conspirators fling open the gates for him. The Carthaginian army pours into the city, but at the last moment, the governor of the city, a one Marcus Livius, despite his extreme drunken intoxication, manages to rally the Roman troops together where they take refuge in the citadel of the city, which just happens to block the port. It's one of those two-step forward, one-step back kind of moments. There's a story of how Hannibal, ingeniously out-of-the-box thinking here, takes the ships in the inner harbor, puts them on these log rollers, and manages to roll them across one of the larger streets to the outer harbor. But with the citadel in Roman hands, Tarentum is effectively neutralized as a port. And this just as a Carthaginian fleet shows up and then has to be turned away. This is going to be an example of how a city that the Punic forces managed to capture ends up becoming a liability. Now, they're not able to stay around Tarentum for very long. In 211, Hannibal gets reports that the city of Capua is now under attack. Indeed, a man by the name of Claudius Nero has taken his Roman force and has not only managed to march on Capua, but has managed to surround the city with a dual ring of fortifications, one facing inward to lay siege, and another one on the outside to provide protection. Hannibal, of course, has to disengage from Tarentum, march back across the peninsula, and then attack these ring of fortifications, which he does twice, but he's not able to break through. And that leaves him in a very difficult situation. After all, his greatest ally is under threat, and he can't do anything to help him out. And he reasons that if he attacks something that is more near and dear to the Romans, it might psychologically unnerve them enough to make them disengage from Capua. And with that, he abandons Capua and marches on Rome. But the Rome of 211 is much different than the Rome of 216. It's much more confident. Again, Rome had about 25 legions in the field. That's almost 250,000 men under arms. And when he marches on Rome, this confidence shows. The Romans go so far as to take the garrison legion of Rome, fling open the gates, and march it around the city right under Hannibal's nose. To indicate to him, hey, we see you and the rest of you Carthaginian scum up on that hill, and we don't care. Go nuts. Ravage the fields. Destroy the countryside. We're used to it by now. Do what you want. We got you outnumbered. I want to take a moment to point out the poignancy that at least I feel about this particular moment in time, because I think this was a personal high-water mark for Hannibal. When you read the history books or you listen to a historian talk about high-water marks, it's kind of easy for them to point them out because they've got a quantity of time for retrospection, and in this case, over 2 millennia. But how many times in history does a commander walk out onto a field and realize and think to themselves, you know what, this is about as far as I'm going to get? I wonder if these were the thoughts that might have gone through the head of somebody like Robert E. Lee when he saw his forces being thrown back at the copse of trees after the ill-fated Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of Gettysburg. I wonder if Rommel might have thought something like this when he saw the Quatara Depression in North Africa and realized his famous flanking maneuver would no longer work, and then he was turned around at El Alamein. You have to admit, there's a certain degree of sadness thinking about all this. Hannibal, with his one good eye, gazing onto the great city of Rome before him, so close yet so far, knowing that he's probably not going to get much further than this. Things start going really bad for the Carthaginians at this point. Hannibal has to withdraw from Rome. In 211, Capua falls. And then in 209, the Romans manage to recapture the city at Tarentum as well. And so the area that Hannibal now owns is limited to a small section along the toe of the Italian peninsula. Now it's onto this that his brother Hasdrubal finally shows up. If you recall what I said about Hasdrubal before, the man was committed to his brother. He'd been trying to get an army into Italy for quite some time. But when it comes to anything military, how do you say this nicely? The guy gets at least an A for effort, right? He took his army after his defeat at the Battle of Baecula, managed to escape the clutches of Scipio, escaped the Iberian Peninsula, and then took the same path through Gaul and then across the Alps, and then arrived in Italy in 207. His appearance actually caused a great deal of concern within the Roman Senate, almost to the point of sheer panic. The Romans were worried that if the two Barcas managed to combine their forces, they'd create some sort of Carthaginian super army that would, under the command of somebody like Hannibal, run amok, maybe even take out Rome, God forbid. Not likely, but there was a great deal of fear. To the Romans, this was worse than like a zombie apocalypse. But it's interesting to see the manner in which the Romans dealt with this new challenge. It shows how the Roman system was evolving. Adrian Goldsworthy comments on this, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. Quote, "This was not like 218. The Romans were in a far higher state of mobilization, their leaders and armies more experienced and effective. Their response to the news of the Carthaginians' intentions was rapid." End quote. After arriving in Italy, Hasdrubal does this thing where he cautiously moves along the eastern seaboard of Italy, along the Adriatic coast. He's, of course, picked up by a Roman army who kind of shadow him from a distance, but they don't exactly know what he intends to do. Hasdrubal, of course, is trying desperately to get in contact with his brother in order to link up their forces. And then he does something that makes me kind of question his abilities as a commander. He sends out these messengers in order to get in contact with his brother, who he thinks is someplace down in southern Italy. He doesn't know exactly where. And he writes in his note, "Dear Hannibal, finally made it to Italy. The weather is great here. I'm here with the boys. I'm in location X. I'm going to be moving to location Y. Come and find me. Oh, postscript, don't tell the Romans." And of course, as soon as he sends out the messengers, every single one of them gets intercepted by the Romans, and now they know exactly where he's going to. The Romans up until this point had taken a very defensive posture when they heard about the two Barcas entering into Italy. They had divided up their forces. One consular army was up in the north under the command of Marcus Livius Salinator, who was keeping a close eye on Hasdrubal. Meanwhile, another consular army was down in the south under the command of Gaius Claudius Nero, who was also keeping a close vigil on Hannibal. Now, when they figured out what Hasdrubal was up to, they figured they were going to take out the lesser of the two evils. And so Nero does this thing that was quite impressive. He leaves a skeletal force near Hannibal, but they light multiple fires in order to give the appearance that their army isn't moving. And then in the middle of the night, he force marches his men all the way to the north and links up with Salinator. Hasdrubal quickly realized that he wasn't dealing with just one consular army, but with two. And at that point, Hasdrubal's only recourse was to try to retreat. He manages to withdraw his forces in the middle of the night, kind of march them to the north. But the problem is that the Carthaginians don't really know the lay of the land. They're still relatively new to Italy. Their guides betray them, misdirect them, and before you know it, the entire Carthaginian force, which hasn't had any sleep, hasn't had any chance to get anything good to eat, is now lost along the banks of a river called Metaurus. And it was here that both Roman consular armies managed to find the Carthaginians and pounce on them. The Battle of Metaurus on June 22, 207, despite all the Roman advantages, was actually a battle that could have gone either way. This was a giant infantry clash. On one side, you had the Carthaginian infantry along with their Spanish mercenaries, and on the other side, you had the Roman legions. Both lines basically moved towards one another, and they started to brawl. Initially, Hasdrubal actually gained the advantage. His heavy infantry managed to smash into the Roman left flank and began to make it waver. And who knows, if this had continued, this might have been a Carthaginian victory. But this battle also shows how the Romans were evolving in regards to their tactics. They were learning, they were adapting. Nero, who was on the right flank, realized that the Roman right flank wasn't really doing much, and so he stripped the entire line down to just a skeletal force, then took all of these men, marched them around behind the Roman army, and threw it into his enemy's flank. Nero, to say the least, was a gambling man, but his gamble paid off. The Romans managed to come in not only on the Carthaginian flank, but they managed to actually get around behind the enemy line. And of course, this is not a very sustainable position. Hasdrubal watched as his men began to fall back. They began to retreat, stumbling into one another. The retreat became into a rout. And at that point, Hasdrubal knew that the game was up, that his cause was lost. And in a final moment of defiance, he charged his horse directly into the Roman line, where he was immediately cut down. The Romans pressed their offensive. They charged directly into the Carthaginians, wiping out this entire force. And to drive home the point, Nero had the head of Hasdrubal thrown into Hannibal's camp a few days later. This is going to be another nail in the coffin of the Carthaginian campaign in Italy. And it's not going to be the last. In 205, Mago, another devoted brother of Hannibal, shows up in Italy as well. As you recall, he got kicked out of Spain after the Battle of Alyppa. But the force that he arrives with is so small, it's only about 12,000 infantry, about 2,000 cavalry, that the Roman Senate doesn't freak out. There's no panic. They don't even send a consular army to deal with it. They send a praetor. In 203, a man by the name of Publius Quintilius Varus shows up with 4 legions, and the ensuing battle isn't even so much a battle, it's kind of more of a mop-up operation. It's during this clash that Mago gets hit in the thigh with a javelin. He has to withdraw from the field, and he watches as his army collapses before him. And then on his way back to Carthage, he dies from the wounds. Now, Hannibal doesn't have very much time to lament the loss of his brothers. In 203, he gets the call from the homeland. Carthage is now under attack, and Hannibal has no other option than to withdraw from Italy and go back to North Africa. So how did it end up like this? How is it now that Carthage is a place that's under attack? Well, if you recall, in 205, Scipio returns from Spain to Rome to assume his consulship. His first executive order, so to speak, is that he is going to invade North Africa. He knows that by bringing war to the Punic homeland, he is not only going to gain the initiative, but he's going to force Hannibal's hand. Now, this is an idea that does not go over well within the Roman Senate. The Senate does not like Scipio. He's too young. He's too popular. His hair is too long. The members of the old guard in the Roman Senate, including the very venerable at this point, Fabius Maximus, want to stick to the Fabian strategy. They want to kick Hannibal out of Italy first, and you can't exactly blame them for doing this. I mean, this is a strategy that seems to have been working up until this point. So members of this establishment try to do everything they can to block Scipio. There's fierce debate going on in the Senate House. They try to demonize him in the eyes of the people. There's even a suggestion that they go so far as to ban Scipio from raising fresh troops in Italy. It's sad, but they really want him to fail. So, despite this ban on raising troops, Scipio's popularity at this point is out through the roof, and when the call goes out, he gets about 7,000 Italian volunteers. But he knows that he needs even more troops and more allies, so he does two things. First, he sends his sub-commander Laelius to North Africa in order to continue negotiations with the Numidian prince Massinissa, who is at this point very pro-Roman and in the process of fighting a civil war in Numidia for domination. Second of all, Scipio knows he needs to tap into a manpower source of men that are not only experienced in war, who have fought against Hannibal, and most importantly, are people that the Senate would basically overlook. Scipio doesn't have to look very far for this. On the island of Sicily are 2 entire legions of men that have been exiled by the Senate for their failure at the Battle of Cannae. Men who fought against Hannibal and were placed on that island and have been waiting for over a decade for a chance at redemption. And Scipio gives them that shot. In 205, he moves his entire force to the island of Sicily and begins intense training for over a year. Now, the Senate is not exactly happy with Scipio because he's basically found himself a loophole. And so what they do, since they can't exactly court-martial the guy, is they send a board of inquiry. They start spreading rumors that the guy is loafing about and basically wasting military resources, but when this board of inquiry arrives on the island of Sicily, they realize that Scipio has trained and drilled one of the finest Roman armies that has ever walked the earth. By 204, Scipio is ready to unleash this army. The invasion of North Africa begins by Roman forces landing near the city of Utica. Scipio immediately links up with his now ally Massinissa, and the two of them lay siege to the city. The Carthaginian response to this is quite immediate. They recruit a massive army and then place it under the command of Hasdrubal Gisco. And if you recall, Gisco was the very man that Scipio managed to defeat at the Battle of Alyppa. However, Gisco is not going to be doing this alone. He brings in his Numidian allies under the command of a king Syphax, who just happens to be the very same man that Massinissa has been fighting with this entire time for domination of Numidia. Syphax is kind of an interesting character. He's one of these people whose loyalty is always available to the highest bidder. But Gisco comes up with a creative solution for this. He brings Syphax into the family by arranging a marriage between him and his daughter Sophonisba. Now, just a note on Sophonisba. She is a woman who the historians regard as having surpassing beauty and exceptional intellect. She makes Helen of Troy look like a walrus, but at the same time has the cunning of a Cleopatra. And she keeps him in line. Every time Syphax whines and complains that he doesn't want to fight, she smacks him in the head and he goes right off to battle. So these two forces eventually meet up in an area south of Utica. And this is a huge problem for Scipio because he's vastly outnumbered and he knows that he's not getting any more reinforcements. Again, as I had mentioned before, the old guard in the Roman Senate want him to fail. So he's got to come up with a plan B, and he's got to do it fast. And what he does is he sends off a peace delegation to the enemy camp. But what he's really doing is he's scouting out the enemy looking for any signs of weakness. And he discovers one. He finds out that the Carthaginian camp, all of their dwellings, their huts, their tents, they're made out of things like straw and cloth and wood. And so, based on this, he comes up with an ingenious idea in order to ambush his enemy. In the middle of the night, he sends out his forces, along with Massinissa's cavalry, and he positions them right outside the Punic encampment in hiding. And then he starts sending in soldiers one by one in order to start lighting fires all over the enemy camp. Now, like with any plan, you need a little bit of luck, and that's exactly what he got. The wind hit the fires just right, and before you know it, the entire Punic camp became one giant bonfire. The ensuing conflagration managed to wipe out a big chunk of Gisco's forces. And the ones that managed to escape the flame, well, as soon as they ran out of the camp, they ran directly into Scipio's waiting ambush. This quickly devolved into a slaughter. And with that, Scipio was able to rout this entire Carthaginian force. The only major downside to all this was that both Syphax and Gisco both managed to escape. They rounded up the survivors, they brought in more mercenaries, Carthage reinforced them again with more troops, and then in 203 they had themselves another army. These two forces managed to confront one another at a place called the Great Plains. Now, I'm going to spare you the details, but suffice it to say that between Scipio's military expertise and Massinissa's cavalry abilities, well, they managed to mop up. But this time, Gisco and Syphax didn't get quite so lucky. When Gisco returned to Carthage, he was met by a less than enthusiastic Senate. They promptly relieved him of his command as they came to their senses and realized that, Gisco was a complete and total idiot. And then you got to kind of feel sorry for the man. He had to end up committing suicide in order to avoid a Carthaginian lynch mob. And his compatriot Syphax didn't do that much better. Syphax jumped on his horse and ran all the way back to Numidia, where he took refuge in one of his palaces. And, of course, Massinissa was right on his heels. But as I've always emphasized, Massinissa was the better horseman. He managed to catch up with Syphax, capture him, put him in chains, and then have him executed. After all this time and all this fighting, Massinissa finally got what he wanted. He was king of Numidia. Okay, but here's the part where it gets a little weird and surreal. When Massinissa is done executing Syphax, he starts going through all of his stuff in his royal palace, and it's at that point that he discovers Sophonisba, Syphax's wife, if you recall, the daughter of Gisco, the woman of surpassing beauty and incredible intellect waiting for him. And her charms worked on him just as well as they did on Syphax. Massinissa marries Sophonisba right on the spot. And when Scipio hears about this, he doesn't like it. He immediately declares Sophonisba a prisoner of the Roman state. He figures that his best cavalry commander being married to the daughter of his enemy is just too much of a conflict of interest. Massinissa really didn't have much of a choice. He grudgingly agreed with Scipio. I guess in the end being king of Numidia was enough for him, but where did that leave her? Well, Sophonisba was really given two choices. She could either be shipped off to Rome and become a prisoner and put on display someplace, or she could continue to be defiant. And being the daughter of a Carthaginian noble and the sworn enemy of Rome, she opted to do the latter. In a last act of defiance, and this kind of is a bit of foreshadowing of what's going to be happening in the future, the story of Cleopatra readily comes to mind. She decides to drink poison and take her own life. She would rather be dead than be a prisoner of Rome. And that gives you kind of an idea of just how nasty this war was getting. Now, speaking of bad situations, Carthage was in a desperate spot at this point. Her armies were wiped out, her generals were mainly dead, the Barca clan was almost non-existent, and their only good general, Hannibal, was in another continent. So the Carthaginian high command, their senate, did what they had to do. They played the peace card. You ever heard that old expression every once in a while, declare peace? It really messes around with the enemy's mind. And that's exactly what they did. They sent out these peace negotiators to Scipio. Scipio imposed this extremely harsh treaty with very harsh terms, which Carthage readily agreed to. And if you're thinking to yourself, this is probably too good to be true, then you're absolutely right. What Carthage was actually doing was buying time. After the disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Great Plains, Carthage sent out the call to Hannibal saying, hey, you know what? We are really in trouble here. We need your help. We need you to come back as soon as possible, and if you could bring your army, that'd be great. And here's the thing. Hannibal, despite getting lackluster support from the Carthaginian Senate, their inability to really give him a lot of troops and supplies, rerouting troops to other fronts, in a way almost being partly responsible for the death of both of his brothers. Despite all that, Hannibal decided to answer their call. In 202, he returned. Now, keep in mind that the land that he's returning to is a place that he has not seen in almost 3 decades. I mean, he was a small child when he left with his father for Iberia, so he's kind of returning to almost a foreign land. Now, of course, he doesn't come alone. He brings his army, or at least what's left of it. And these troops that are returning from the Italian front, I mean, they are battle-hardened veterans. These are the same people that fought at Cannae. But the problem is that the troops that he picks up when he returns to Carthage are the exact opposite. They're abysmal. They've either never been tested or they've been beaten over and over again in battle. And the real problem for Hannibal is that he doesn't have very much time. Scipio is basically on his doorstep, and he has to figure out a way to integrate these two forces into an effective fighting machine. In the end, Hannibal, whether he's ready or not, has to move out. And so he takes his army to the south of Carthage to a small town called Zama, where the Romans are waiting for him. And then, in true Hannibalistic style, he starts sending out recon parties to kind of figure out what his enemy's up to. He sends 3 spies directly into the Roman camp. Now, these spies are found out, they're captured, they're brought before Scipio, but instead of being executed, Scipio gives them a guided tour of his camp. And he does this because Massinissa and the rest of the cavalry haven't shown up, and he wants to try to use a little bit of subterfuge. He wants to convince Hannibal that, the Roman force doesn't have any horsemen. But here's the thing. After the spies are released back to Hannibal and they report their findings, Hannibal is intrigued because he knows already about Massinissa and the cavalry force. And he wants to meet this guy. Who is this young Roman commander, this Scipio, who has been undefeated in battle, who's using all of these unorthodox techniques, who's using audacity of movement on the battlefield, who's now using subterfuge? I mean, that's kind of Hannibal's game, right? Hannibal's curiosity, the intrigue of the situation, is just a little bit too much for him. He's got to meet the guy. And of course, this is what prompts the meeting that we began this entire episode with. Now, of course, some historians say that this meeting was done for the leaders to hash out some sort of peace deal. Others say it was a chance for the commanders to buy time to bring in more reinforcements. But as I had mentioned to you before, I think there was much more to it than just that. You had 2 commanders that were in charge of respective armies that were geniuses at what they did. They were in a league all unto themselves. And when you end up in a situation like that, it's almost like you have to reach out to that other person in order to understand yourself. It goes without saying that the political situation was not conducive to a peace-negotiated settlement. I think that was kind of an inevitability. But for that night, these 2 men didn't meet as enemies, they met as opponents. And if the situation was a little different, these are 2 men that could have been even colleagues. And what a powerful combination that would have been. The rest of the meeting was conducted on very amicable terms, and both commanders left with a certain degree of appreciation for the other, if not a sense of awe. They returned to their own commands, and the next morning, the scene was set for one of the most climactic battles in human history. On both sides, you had 2 massive armies that were led by 2 of the most capable military geniuses of their time. 2 men that had never been defeated in a pitched battle before. On both sides, you had the veterans of the Battle of Cannae squaring off at one another. On one side, you had a group that was fighting for redemption, and the other, they were fighting for their very survival. And when the command was given, both forces started moving towards one another, and with that, the Battle of Zama began. This, of course, ends part 5 of the Punic War series. I want to thank everybody for your time and your exceptional patience. This has been a very long episode. Now, for those of you out there who have enjoyed what you've listened to, please give the show a like. If you have time and you're interested in getting automatic downloads, subscribe to the series, or at least spread word about the podcast. For those of you coming at me from Google Play or iTunes, please rate or review. And if you have any feedback, I can be available at flashpointhistory, that's all one word, flashpointhistory@gmail.com. Now join us in our next episode, Part 6, Delenda est Carthago, where we talk about the end of the Battle of Zama and the post-war world. Until that time, I want to thank you guys again for your time and for listening.